I found the letter on a Tuesday. Not the kind of letter you frame, the kind you read 3 times because your hands won't stop shaking long enough for your eyes to focus. The kind with her name in his handwriting, a name I recognized because it was the same name scrawled in the hotel registry I was never supposed to see. The kind of letter that ends with "our child" and a date, and the exact week he had pressed his forehead against mine and whispered that I was the only woman he had ever truly wanted. I was 23 years old. I was standing in the most beautiful house I had ever entered, and I was holding the end of everything I thought I was building. But here is what they never tell you about devastation. Sometimes it doesn't break you. Sometimes it simply clarifies. My name, at least the name that matters to this story, was Evangeline Voss before it became anything else. I came to New York from Philadelphia in the autumn of 1889, with a small trunk, a face that people described as arresting rather than pretty, and an ambition so acute it occasionally felt like physical pain. I had no family connections worth mentioning. My father had been a minor railroad accountant, ironic as it would turn out, and my mother had died believing that good manners and a straight spine were sufficient armor against the world. She was wrong, but she gave me the spine, and I used it differently than she intended. I met Cornelius Ashford III at a musicale on West 57th Street. He was everything the room wanted him to be, tall, copper-haired, with the particular kind of confidence that only arrives pre-installed in men whose grandfathers were already rich. He laughed at the right moments. He knew which wines were being discussed and which were being drunk. He found me near the window, away from everyone else, and said, and I remember this precisely, "You look like someone who finds this as exhausting as I do." I should have noted even then how practiced that line was. But I didn't. I was 23 and hungry, and he was magnificent. And when Cornelius Ashford III decided to pursue you, the pursuit itself was like being caught in a beautiful current. Flowers arrived, notes arrived, invitations to dinners I had never expected to attend. Within 4 months, I was wearing a sapphire the size of my thumbnail on my left hand and being discussed, sometimes admiringly, sometimes acidly, in every drawing room from Murray Hill to the tip of Fifth Avenue. His mother had been dead 3 years. His father, Edmund Ashford Sr., lived in the original family mansion at the northern end of the avenue, a great gray granite fortress of a house that seemed to have opinions about the people who entered it. Neil and I called on him twice during our engagement. Both times, Edmund Sr. barely looked at me. He asked me 2 questions, what I had read recently, and whether I understood the mechanism by which the government issued railroad bonds. I answered both correctly. He said nothing. I took this as approval. Neil laughed about his father on the carriage ride home. "Don't worry about him," he said. "He's essentially furniture." I thought that was unkind. I filed it away. The engagement lasted 7 months. They were not 7 peaceful months. Nothing in that world was peaceful. It only performed peace, the way a house fire performs warmth. But they were months in which I believed, with the breathless sincerity of someone who has never yet been truly betrayed, that I had found the door I was meant to walk through. And then I found the letter. I was in Neil's study. He had asked me to retrieve a document for his solicitor, a routine errand, a gesture of trust, or so I believed, and the letter was not hidden. That was the thing that hit me hardest afterward. It wasn't hidden, it was simply there, beneath a ledger, the way you'd leave something you never imagined anyone would question. The envelope had been opened and refolded, and the handwriting was unmistakably a woman's, looping, urgent, slightly reckless, and her name was Celeste, and she was at an address in the Tenderloin district, and she was expecting his child in April, and she loved him, she said, the way she loved breathing. I stood in that study for what felt like an entire season of my life. Then I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, went back to the drawing room, handed the document to the solicitor, made conversation about the weather in Newport, drank tea, waited. I confronted Neil that evening. I want you to understand how I did it. Not with tears, not with screaming. I sat across from him at the small writing desk in his library, placed the letter between us as though it were a business document, and said, "I'd like you to explain this at whatever length you feel is necessary." He looked at the letter, he looked at me, and he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He looked instead slightly annoyed. "Evangeline," he said, "these things happen. You're a sophisticated woman. I assumed you understood the way these arrangements." "These arrangements," I repeated. "Men of my position," he said, and then continued, and I will not repeat what followed, because it wasn't worth the air it displaced. What I will tell you is that within the space of 12 minutes, he offered me a financial settlement to quietly dissolve our engagement, suggested that I might find a perfectly suitable match among the second-tier families he could recommend, and implied, without quite saying it outright, that any social consequence I feared would be significantly worse if I made a scene. He expected me to leave. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then something settled in me, something cold and very clear, like a frozen river that has finally decided it is done moving. If you're still listening, I think you and I are the same kind of haunted. I tell these stories often, some darker than this one, some stranger, all of them true to the bone of what people will do when they've run out of options and found something fiercer underneath. The kind of stories that find you at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep, and you need to know that someone else has survived the unsurvivable. If that pulls you in, stay close. What's coming next will make this moment look like a prologue. "Thank you, Neil," I said. "That was very illuminating." And I left. I did not go home. I walked. In New York in 1889, a woman walking alone on Fifth Avenue at 10 at night was not precisely acceptable, but I found that I had stopped caring about precisely acceptable somewhere between the second and third minute of Neil's explanation. I walked north. Without entirely planning it, I walked until I was standing in front of the gray granite fortress. Edmund Ashford Sr.'s lights were still burning. He was, I would later learn, almost always awake at 10 in the evening. He slept poorly and read voraciously, and occasionally walked his own halls at 2 in the morning like a general reviewing his territory after a battle. His staff were loyal because he paid them extraordinarily and spoke to them as though they were human beings, which in that era and in that class was rarer than any of the jewels in his vault. I did not ring the bell that night. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the lit windows and thought, with the peculiar clarity of someone who has just had their entire future dissolved, that I needed a new plan. Not a reactive plan, not a plan built from rage, a surgical plan. I went home, I sat at my desk until 3 in the morning, and I wrote out in my precise accountant's daughter handwriting every single thing I knew about Edmund Ashford Sr. What I knew was this: he was 64 years old and had been a widower for 3 years. He had built the Ashford Railroad empire from a single short line in Ohio in 1851, and had expanded it through what his admirers called vision and what his enemies called savagery, and both were correct. He sat on the boards of 4 banks. He had given, in the last decade, approximately $2 million to various institutions, libraries, hospitals, a school in Brooklyn, in a pattern that suggested he was genuinely philanthropic or desperately trying to purchase something from God. He attended church every Sunday, ate dinner alone most evenings, and was reported by those who knew him to be brilliant, exacting, and profoundly privately sad. He had not been seen at a social event in 8 months. He had no mistress. He had, as far as I could determine, no one. I underlined that last part. Now, I need you to understand something, because I want to be honest with you even when it is not flattering to me. What I began planning that night was not love. I will not pretend otherwise. It was architecture. Cold, precise, slightly ruthless architecture. I had been offered a financial settlement to disappear, and instead I decided to restructure the entire building. If I could not be the Ashford heir's wife, I would aim, and I am aware of how this sounds, I was aware aware of it then, considerably higher. But here is what architecture requires that rage never tells you. Patience. Patience so deep that it looks like serenity. You cannot storm a granite fortress. You have to make yourself interesting enough that the door opens from the inside. I had 3 assets. My face, which I have already described as arresting rather than pretty, which is better actually, because arresting is memorable and pretty is forgettable. My mind, which was genuinely good, trained by years of reading everything I could find, because in my family books were cheaper than parties, and my father's background in railroad accounting, which meant I could speak the language of Edmund Ashford's world, not as an ornament, but as someone who understood it. I began to position myself. The first step was managing the dissolution of the engagement without scandal. Neil, predictably, was relieved when I agreed to frame it as a mutual decision. He was less predictably grateful. He sent flowers. I sent them back. Not out of anger, I simply didn't need them anymore, and I found that I had no patience left for gestures that cost nothing. I kept the sapphire. He didn't ask for it. He knew better. The announcement appeared in the society pages with the careful phrasing that indicated nothing and implied everything. Miss Voss and Mr. Ashford have, by mutual agreement, dissolved their engagement, and both parties wish the other every happiness. Every reader in the relevant zip codes of Manhattan understood that I had been discarded. That was fine. People who believe they know the ending stop watching. This to offer, I walked into a library with Tocqueville and a coldly arranged intention. I walked out with the only thing I ever actually wanted, which was, in the end, to be known. Some rooms open from the inside. You only have to be interesting enough to wait.